Today, we're going to talk about a name you might have heard, especially if you're into true crime or ghost stories, Delphine LaLaurie. She was a high society figure in New Orleans back in the 1830s, but her name has come to mean something else entirely, a kind of cruelty that is just, well, it's really hard to wrap your head around.
And her story, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What kind of darkness can be hiding right there in plain sight behind a pretty face and a fancy house? Because on the surface, Madame LaLaurie was the definition of grace and charm. But in private, she was a monster. So let's get into it.
Today, we're going to talk about a name you might have heard, especially if you're into true crime or ghost stories, Delphine LaLaurie. She was a high society figure in New Orleans back in the 1830s, but her name has come to mean something else entirely, a kind of cruelty that is just, well, it's really hard to wrap your head around.
And her story, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What kind of darkness can be hiding right there in plain sight behind a pretty face and a fancy house? Because on the surface, Madame LaLaurie was the definition of grace and charm. But in private, she was a monster. So let's get into it.
And where do you even start with a story like this? Well, let's jump right into the most dramatic part, the moment her perfect image literally went up in flames, revealing something so awful it shocked a city that, frankly, was already used to a lot of violence. So, picture this. The date is April 10th, 1834. You're in the French Quarter in New Orleans, and smoke starts pouring out of this gorgeous, stately mansion on Royal Street, the LaLaurie Mansion. A crowd starts to gather, and word gets out that the fire started in the kitchen, but there are enslaved people trapped upstairs, in the attic. When rescuers ask for the keys, though, the LaLauries just refuse, flat out. So a judge has to order the doors broken down, and what they found inside when they smashed through that door, it had very little to do with the fire. It was something else entirely. And I have to pause here because what you're reading, this isn't some made-up stuff for a horror movie. No, these are the actual descriptions from the newspapers of the time. They found people chained up, horribly mutilated, subjected to things that are just sickening to even describe. A man with a hole in his head, a woman whose bones had been broken and then reset in grotesque ways, another whose skin was peeled off her body. It's unimaginable. 7. They found 7 people still alive in that attic. 7 human beings suffering in ways we can't comprehend, in total secret just a few feet away from rooms where the city's most powerful people were sipping wine at lavish parties. So this all leads to the obvious question, right? Who was this woman? How could someone so respected in public be capable of this? It's this insane split, this complete double life. To everyone who mattered in New Orleans society, she was this charming, wealthy, church-going woman, the perfect hostess. But behind those locked doors, she was a sadistic torturer, a serial killer, some even say a twisted human experimenter. To get a handle on her, you really have to understand the world she came from. She was born Marie Delphine McCarty, right at the absolute top of the food chain in New Orleans slave-owning society. Her family was rich, powerful, and like many others, they were absolutely terrified of slave rebellions. And that fear, they used it to justify just about any level of brutality to maintain control. And her own power just grew and grew her whole life. You can kind of track it through her 3 marriages. Each one just cemented her status, her wealth, and her absolute authority over the people she owned. But here's something that is so important to get. Madame LaLaurie wasn't just a one-off monster. She didn't exist in a vacuum. No, she was the product of an entire system, a legal system, a social system that didn't just allow for her cruelty, it actively enabled it. The legal foundation for all of this was something called the Code Noir, or the Black Code. Now, on paper, it looked like it was setting rules for slavery. But what it really did was legalize the most horrific abuse by just putting a price tag on it. I mean, just look at this. It's unbelievable. Beating a person without cause, a $10 fine. Mutilating them, $2 a day. Murdering someone, you just had to pay their owner whatever they were worth. For a woman as rich as LaLaurie, this was nothing. It was pocket change. Cruelty wasn't a crime. It was a luxury item for the rich. And this created a culture where this kind of violence was just normal. It wasn't even seen as that unusual. Her own cousin killed an enslaved woman and nothing happened. For years, LaLaurie's neighbors heard the screams. They smelled, well, you can imagine. And they did nothing. She'd even been investigated before, and the result? A little slap on the wrist. That's it. Which brings us to what happened after the fire. You know, with everything out in the open, the whole city knows what she's done. You'd think, okay, now justice will be served. Nope, that is not what happened. Not even close. So an angry mob gathers outside her house ready to tear it and her apart. And how does she get away? In one of the most unbelievable ironies of this whole story, her enslaved coachman, a man named Bastian, helps her. He warns her, and then she just calmly gets into her carriage like she's going for a typical afternoon ride, and he whips the horses right through the furious crowd to a boat that's waiting for her. And just like that, she was gone. And the punchline to this whole sick story is infuriating. Delphine LaLaurie gets away. She goes to Paris, lives out a long, comfortable life, and dies of natural causes in 1849. For some of the most horrible crimes you can imagine, she was never arrested, never tried, and never, ever punished. The total lack of accountability is just staggering. We know she owned 30 enslaved people when the fire broke out. Records show that 11 of them were sold later. But the other 19, they just vanished, wiped from all official records. We can only guess what happened to them. Which, of course, raises the question, what about the 7 survivors they pulled from that attic? Well, for 2 days, they were put on public display, almost like a circus sideshow, for thousands of people to come and gawk at their injuries. And after that, they vanished from the historical record too. The same system that allowed them to be tortured also made sure their stories were erased. And that idea of people's lives and suffering being erased, that's really at the heart of what the LaLaurie story has come to mean today. You know, if you go to New Orleans today, the LaLaurie Mansion is a huge tourist stop. It's famous as the most haunted house in America. It's all about ghosts and spooky entertainment. But that myth completely papers over the reality. This isn't a ghost story. It's a true story about systemic evil. It's not a haunted house. It's a monument to injustice, and a reminder of the real people whose suffering has been turned into a thrill ride. Because when we focus on the spooky legends and the ghost stories, we do a huge disservice to the actual human beings who suffered and died in that house. In a weird way, by turning it into entertainment, we're erasing them all over again. So, I want to leave you with this one last thought. It's from the historian Dr. Tia Miles, and I think it just hits the nail on the head. She said, she was not a frightening exception to the slave system. She was its inevitable product. And that's really the point. The greatest horror at 1140 Royal Street wasn't just one evil one. It was the entire society that created her, protected her, and in the end, let her get away with it all. Thanks for watching.
Subscribe to the Hub of Crime Analysis.